Here we are at week 37 of our journey through the Word. This week we will see episodes of insolence, of deep grief, of clouded judgment that results in actions that have no wisdom. And this week we begin with the slaying of Absalom. We hear David give Joab orders that he is to deal kindly with Absalom. But we see that once again, Joab spurns David's orders and he doesn't have any compassion for Absalom when he finds him. But why does David have such compassion for Absalom? Well, number one, this is his son. And secondly, I believe that David deals with some guilt over this whole episode because it's a result of David not dealing correctly with his son Amnon when he raped his sister. And we see that Absalom is now reacting to what his father did not do. And so I believe David deals with some guilt over this. And so we see that when Joab comes upon Absalom hanging from a tree because of his hair, that's got to be a lot of hair. And we see that Joab takes 3 spears, drives Absalom through. But we also see in this story that there are 10 young men who carry Joab's armor. This gives us also some information about armor bearers. It wasn't just one man on one man. We see that Joab has 10 armor bearers, those who carry his armor. These are men who would circle around him and fight with him. And how many did David have? We really don't know. But so often we think of armor bearers as one armor bearer per one person. But that's not the case as we see in this story. We also see that David's grief over the loss of his son overshadows his position as commander-in-chief, and that instead of sitting in the gate as the men come back from war and honoring these men who fought for him, David, he goes into grief and brings no honor to these men. And it's at Joab's rebuke that basically what Joab says is, you better snap out of this before it's too late and you lose everything. Fortunately for David's sake, David listens to this and he does go sit in the gate and brings honor to his men. But unfortunately, these men who have fought so hard for David and for his kingdom had brought, David's actions had actually brought shame on them rather than any kind of honor. As we watch David's return to Jerusalem, we once again see the man Shimei, the Benjamite, who is the son of Gera, who comes to David. And now, when David was leaving the city, he comes and he curses David. And now that David is coming back to the city, we see Shimei come and he's so repentant. I'm so sorry. But I want you to remember this name, Shimei, because although David doesn't do anything to Shimei at that moment, and although Joab's saying, let me just go kill him, and David says, no, there'll be no killing right now. But the consequence for this man's action is delayed. It's not eradicated, it's delayed. And so remember that name, because we're going to see that there is consequence for this action in the days to come. But we will leave that for its time. We also find that as David is returning, that Mephibosheth comes and David says, well, why didn't you come with me? And Mephibosheth, you'll read and hear what Mephibosheth says. And so we find that there is definitely some animosity between Mephibosheth and his servant Ziba. And yet Ziba was there when David was fleeing from Absalom and fleeing the city. And Ziba comes and he brings provisions for David and for his people. And as I watch the wisdom of David in this, I mean, Ziba has been a help to David. And yet there is this definite animosity between Mephibosheth and Ziba. So what does David do? Well, David, he divides the land. And in dividing the land, he honors Mephibosheth, he honors Ziba. And as we continue on, we see that there is this argument that as they're bringing him back, the people, the men of Judah, the elders of Judah, come and bring back the king, and then the other 10 tribes come and say, wait a minute, we have 10 pieces of our right over David, and we should have been called to bring David back. And so we see the animosity once again between the men of Judah and the men of Benjamin. Interesting thought, the men of Judah and the men of Benjamin who are bringing David back. And so we find that there is this fragility in the foundation of Israel. And there is this tug of war, which we will see play out in the days to come. Even now, we see this tug of war between the leaders and the men of Ephraim and the area of Ephraim and the men of Judah. And as I say, in the days to come, we are going to see this play out. You know, this takes us back to the blessing that Jacob spoke over his sons when he was dying. And we see the blessing that he speaks over Joseph, which is where the tribe of Ephraim comes from. And then we see the words that are spoken over Judah. Definitely, there are two leaderships and two kinds of leaderships. And we've talked about that before. And this becomes the problem within Israel and understanding leadership. This is the problem within the church even today, as being one who has a call to the church that doesn't stay within the confines of the local church. I know how these things can play out even in the church, and how we need to understand that there is the leadership within the church, the domestic leadership, the pastors, the elders of the church, and those that are called to go beyond the walls of the church. And we need to understand that relationship and honor that relationship. Otherwise, that tug of war will continue on even in the church world today. Then we see the death of Amasa. We hear David's promise to Amasa that he will put him over the army in place of Joab. Obviously, David is tired of Joab's insubordination. And yet we look and say, well, how come he's so forgiving of Amasa? Didn't Amasa side with Absalom, and wasn't he over Absalom's troops? Well, once again, we have to look at our genealogy charts, and what we find is that Amasa is David's nephew. We see that David has two sisters. He has a sister whose name is Abigail and a sister whose name is Zeruiah. And we know that Abigail has a son, and that son's name is Amasa. We know that Zeruiah has 3 sons, and these are the 3 that go with David, and Joab being the leader of the 3. And so we see that both Amasa and Joab are David's nephews, which obviously makes Amasa and Joab cousins. So we can see why there is a willingness to forgive Amasa. But although David may forgive Amasa, we see that Joab does not. And so we see this time it's the murder. This is not an act of war. When Joab kills Amasa, this is not an act of war. This is an act of self-preservation and an act of pride. And once again, although we don't see immediate consequence for Joab's murder, we will see that it is delayed, but not eliminated. And we will see that again in the days to come. That brings us to the revenge of the Gibeonites. For 3 years, we see that there is famine in the land, and that David goes to God and says, what is the problem here? And God shows David the reason for this famine. And he says that this is a result of the covenant that Saul has broken with the Gibeonites. We have to go back to the time when Joshua and the children of Israel were coming into the land. We see that they made a covenant with the Gibeonites. You may remember, we've talked about this in the past, that, and yet Saul, he's determined that he's going to eradicate the Gibeonites from the land of Israel. He's zealous for the children of Israel, but in his zealousness, he fails to recognize the covenant that Joshua and the leaders of Israel had made with the Gibeonites. Saul may have forgotten the covenant, but God has not. And so as a result of this, we see that the covenant needs to be reestablished. And it was Saul who broke the covenant. And so it is the descendants of Saul who are chosen. When you look at this and you say, well, wait a minute, I mean, this is horrible. 7 descendants of Saul are taken and hung together to reestablish this covenant. You know, as much as we may, in our Western thinking and in our New Testament thinking, think this is so terrible, we have to remember that these people are living under the law, and the law said it's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. And so the Gibeonites are actually being quite merciful. They could have said, we want a life for every life that Saul took. But in reestablishing this covenant, the Gibeonites say, no, we just want 7 of Saul's sons. Why 7? Because 7, the number 7 in Hebrew literally means oath. And so they said, we just want to put back the promise and the oath that was given us. And so they said, just give us 7 of Saul's sons. And as you read the 7 that are taken, you can go back to the lineage, which you will find when we get to the end of the week. We will find that there's family trees that are given to us in First Chronicles. It's in these family trees that you will be able to determine the 7 descendants of Saul. If you want to look into this even more so and see that this is the reestablishing of the SALT covenant, I went online trying to see if maybe there is a video that I could put in here for you. I'm sure somewhere in all the videos that are on YouTube, I must have a video of the SALT covenant, but found that there was more videos than I wanted to read through. But if you want more information and to go into greater depth, what I can give you is this commercial. If you go to Amazon, plug in, Please Pass the Salt by Shirley Carpenter. I do have a book. It's $1.99 in American funds. And so if you want to obtain a written teaching on the SALT covenant, that is available there. I'm sorry for having to do a commercial, but it's the best I can do at the moment. Otherwise, you can go ahead and weed through all the videos. Hopefully in the days to come, I will do teachings that will be labeled and made available to you, but this is the best I can do at the moment. That brings us to David's Psalm of Deliverance. As we read David's song, his Psalm of Deliverance, we will find that we will see this psalm again. It's in Psalm 18, verses 2 through 50. And of course, this is an important psalm to David, and how many times David thought that his life was over, and how many times he had to flee from death itself. And yet I believe that this psalm is a greater psalm than that this is a prophetic psalm. And in the days to come, we will be looking at when Jesus dies on the cross and the 3 days and 3 nights that he's in the heart of the earth. And I believe this psalm that David writes is a prophetic word of what Jesus will go through for us when he has to go down into Sheol. But we'll look at that more in the days to come. Then we come to David's last words. And as we read David's last words, that David beautifully puts in a song, we find that David's last words don't focus on his difficulties and unlike this in Psalm 18. David's last words focus on and reflect on God's faithfulness and goodness and of God's promise to him. Then we come to David's mighty men. There are 37 men in all. There are David's 30 mighty men, which are listed according to their names. And then we find that there are 3 mighty men who surpass even David's 30 mighty men. And then we find that there are 4 men that are mightier than the 30, but not as mighty as the 3. And David beautifully lists all these men, and we have these men who fight with David, who stand by him through thick and thin. And as I reflected on that, I thought, God, how we need mighty men around us and people who will help us fight our battles, people who will stand beside us through thick and thin. We find others who are David's counselors and David's confidants. But thank God for those mighty men who stand with him. When I think of the people who stand with me, who are intercessors, who fight with me alongside of me, not fight with me, but fight alongside of me when I'm going through difficulties, how grateful I am for those who stand and fight and who will pick up the battle and help to bring the victory. Then we come to the last episode of our journey through 2 Samuel. And it seems like a strange place. You would almost wish that it would end at David's last words and as he focuses on the faithfulness of God. But then we come to this episode of the census. Seems like a strange story to end David's life with. And yet I think as we go on, you'll see that no, it's the right story to end with. We find that once again, God is angry with Israel, and so he incites David to number the people. So how does God incite David to number the people? Well, I don't believe that God tempts David. He just leaves man to his own devices. Every man, including David, has weaknesses. And so in leaving David to his own devices, David's pride rises up. They are not in a time of war. There is no reason to count the troops and see how many fighting men he has. How big is my army? There would only be one reason for David to do that, and that's that horrible, ugly thing called pride that every man has to deal with and keep under control and keep cut off the head. And so we see this giant, this pride rise up. And so David sends Joab out to number the people. You know, when we look at Joab is a strange person, because when David says go out and number the people, Joab knows this is wrong and this is going to end badly. And so we see there are times when Joab it holds to the word of God, and then there are other times that he totally goes against the word of God. And so Joab is a strange person. Perhaps when we look at Joab, we see more of ourselves, sometimes holding on to the word of God and sometimes going against the word of God. As much as we want to be more like David, perhaps we find ourselves more like Joab. And so David has Joab go out and number the people, and as a result, we see that God's anger burns. God comes to David and he says, this is totally against my word. And so pick your consequence. And David says, I don't want to fall into the hands of man. Let me fall into the hands of God. And so we see the plague begins. You see, God is angry with the people. And so the plague begins to bring the consequence. And as we've begun this week and we end this week, we see that there's consequences. And so now the plague is moving across the land, and as it comes to the threshing floor of Onan, and it's in 2 Samuel, the name is Aruna, but in 2 Chronicles, the name is Ornan. Same man, different name. And so as the plague is coming to Jerusalem, it stops, and God stops the angel at the threshing floor. And so we see that David comes, and this is where he makes a sacrifice to God. Aruna, Ornan says, here, take my oxen and take the cart, and it's yours. And David says, I can't offer to God a sacrifice that hasn't cost me anything. And so David pays the price and buys the threshing floor. And this is where God's mercy comes and the plague is stopped. I said before that this is the perfect place for this story to end and this 2 Samuel to end, because this is all about God establishing the kingdom and David's kingdom. And why is this a perfect place? Because as we will go on in the days to come, we will find that this threshing floor that David purchases is the very foundation. This becomes the foundation of the temple. And when you think about what this threshing floor represents, you will find it's a perfect place to end this part and this chapter of David's story, because the threshing floor is the place where man's sin meets the mercy of God. What a beautiful foundation of the temple, the place where God's mercy comes and meets man's sin. This brings us to a new road, not a new series yet, but this brings us to a new road. And this is going to be one of those places that is a very rugged climb. And this will be a difficult journey until you get to chapter 10. It eases up at chapter 10. But if you will be faithful and persevere through chapters 1 through 9, I believe you will be grateful for the foundation. One time as I was reading through 1 Chronicles, I stopped and thought, wait a minute, usually I would just buzz on through and perhaps maybe this is your first time through 1 Chronicles. And if it is, you may choose to just go on through and read it through. But this time when I was reading through 1 Chronicles, I thought, wait a minute, why are there all these genealogies, all these family trees? And I thought, God has a purpose. And so I thought, surely slow down and let's begin to look at these foundations. And so I took out pencil and paper, and as I was reading through, I made a family tree of every one of the genealogies that are listed from chapter 1 to chapter 10. And I thought, God is laying foundations here. And if I want to understand later on, I need these foundations. And it was in doing these foundations that I found out that David had two sisters and who his nephews were. And I thought, oh my goodness, that makes so much more sense. And so, although we've talked about it, for myself, it wasn't until I did these genealogies in First Chronicles that for me it began to connect the dots. So you may choose to just read through them, or you may choose to do a family tree of each of them. You'll notice that as you begin through First Chronicles, it starts with Adam and it goes through to Abraham, and then it shows Abraham's descendants, and then it shows the splintering of the family tree and how these different family trees affect one another. So you can choose which way you would like to do First Chronicles. Yes, I know it's a difficult climb, but I just truly believe that if you will soldier on, just climb that mountain, grab hold, and your foot may want to slip from time to time, but just read it through. If you do nothing else, just read it through. And I think you will find that the view at the top is much clearer. So get your walking shoes on, drink lots of water, let the Spirit of God saturate the pages, and soldier on. And I will see you next week. God bless you.